Hello everyone. So this is going to be a 10-unit review for AP Computer Science A. So the language that we're going to be doing it on is Java because that is, what's going to be on the test. So let's get started. So Unit 1 is basically the primitive types. So what are the purpose of data types? Well, we need a uniform way to store different types of data, right? So what we can do is use integers, doubles, strings, and booleans. These are probably the 4 data types that you're going to see during the test. So the purpose of data types is so that we can differentiate and complete unique tasks with each type, right? So let's look at an example. So let's say we have 2 integers. So if we wanted to add them, we would do x plus y. If we wanted to subtract them, x minus y. If we want to multiply them, x times y. And then if we want to divide, x divided by y. And for modulus, which gets us the remainder of division, would be x% y. So what we need to remember is you guys should be pretty familiar with all of these things, and this is like just a quick refresher. So if you have never learned any of this, maybe you want to look at some of the other videos that I have on my channel. So there's also, aside from all of these operators that we have by default, there's a math library which we can call and use some more. So the first step is you got to import your libraries, and let's say we want to do exponents. So you do math.pal, and let's say we want to do x to the power y. So these would be the parameters we would give it in, and it would give us back a result. And if we want to get the absolute value of a number, we do math.apps x. And if we wanted to get the value of pi, which is 3.14 and so on, we would do math.pi. Keep in mind that you'd want to make sure that each letter is uppercase because it is case sensitive, okay? And then if we want to declare something, it could be int, string, boolean, or whatever, right? And then that's basically where we mention the data type, and then we mention the variable name and an equal sign, and then finally we ended off with what is the value that we're going to store in this variable. So we can see int x equals 10, int y equals 5, or maybe double y equals 2.3. The main difference between ints and doubles is doubles can store decimal values while ints can only store integer values, hence the name, right? So let's look at some of the capabilities that strings might have. There's a big chance that you're going to have to use some of these while doing the FRQ portion of your test. So the first thing is acknowledging that a string is a list of characters. That means you can access each character at an index, okay? So let's say we have the string s, which is equal to hello world. And now we want to access the h value. So using the char at, or maybe the substring library, which I haven't mentioned here, we could access a specific value. So char at 0. So what is the character at index 0? Well, if you look at the string, we know it would give back h, because that's a 0th index. Now let's say we want to maybe replace some words, right? So s.replace. So the first parameter is going to be the string that we're going to be taking out, then a comma, and then the string that we'd be putting in. So if we run this code, what it's going to do is give us MLLO world. So that's how you do it. Let's do some practice. Pause the video right now and try to figure these out. How do you change an integer to a string? Okay, so this is how you do it. So first you obviously have to declare your integer, and then to typecast it to a different data type, what you have to do is have a parentheses, and inside of the parentheses, mention the new data type. And then obviously have your variable at the end, and what this will do is have 12 with quotation marks on it. Now how do you change an integer to a double? So how you change an integer to a double is pretty much the same way. Int x equals 18, and then inside the parentheses we have double and then x. So now our y would be storing 18.0. So now let's get into our unit 2, using objects. So the first thing to do use an object is we obviously need to declare a class, method, and constructor. Some of the default things that are always in a class. Okay, so the syntax here is class hello world. You can obviously have public class hello world. It really doesn't matter. Okay, so then after that you have your parentheses and then end parentheses here. So you want to make sure all the code for your hello world class is going to be in between these parentheses. And also make sure that you indent your methods so that it looks nice and clear to the reader what you're doing. So in this case, we're going to have a few instance variables, which is rate, and then we have our constructor, which always has to have the same name as the class name, hello world in this case, and that's why we have that there. And then we can have a parameter depending on the situation. And then finally, we have a static method called main where we can print out hello world. So let's look some more stuff, okay? Let's say we have a new main method outside of this class. So how would we create an object of that class? So the first thing is, just like how we declare other variables of like integers or other data types, we would do hello world, which is our new data type in a sense. And the hello world we got is from the name of the class. And then the variable name we have is first, and we're going to make that equal to new hello world, where we repeat the class name. And inside of that, we provide a parameter, in this case 1.71. So let's say we want to do first.print. So what that would do is basically print hello world, because you have print here and it's accepting a parameter called string hello, and that's hello world. Now it's going to print ln that and print it out. Now let's get into booleans and if expressions. So the first thing we got to acknowledge is, how do we declare a boolean? So in this case, we can see that we have boolean and a variable called check, and we set it equal to true. Let's say we want to change that value later. So that's also pretty simple. We just do check and equal to false. So a new value. And then we have system.out.println check. As you can see, it's printed out as false here. Now let's look at if expressions. These should be pretty familiar to you and is basically what a boolean does. So what it does is use logical operators where it does comparisons. So we have an integer named x equals 51 and it checks, is x greater than 50? So it does, okay, what is x? 51. So it's 51 greater than 50. And if it does the right thing, it would say, yes, it is true that 51 is greater than 50. So it would print system.out.println num is higher than 50. And as we can see, that is the result that we see here. However, if it looks at the other conditions, which it won't since the first one was met, it'll see, okay, is x equal to 50? Well, obviously that's not true. So it's going to mark it as false, and the else is not needed because the expectation was, considered true in our first if condition. So let's do some practice. Can you guys determine if a year is a leap year? Pause the video and try to find out. Okay, so this is how you do it. First, you got to declare your method, which would be is leap year, and we have to return a value, right? A year is a leap year. So that would either be a true or false, and I'm instantly thinking, okay, this has to be a method that returns a boolean. And of course, we're going to need an input called year, and yeah. So now what I think is, what are some characteristics of a leap year? Well, it comes once in 4 years. So what we could do is maybe use the modulus method and do year %4, and if that is equal to 0, it will return true. So we could look at some recent examples, such as 2020, which was our previous leap year, and if we divide that by 4, we're going to get a remainder of 0, meaning this code would work. Now let's get into loops. So loops are, there's quite a few varieties for loops, where the first one is for loop. So in a for loop, you declare everything inside of the string, inside of the statement. So first you have an int I equals 0 and I is less than s.length. Well, what is s.length? Well, it's this string and basically calling a method that returns the length of it. So I'm going to guess it's around 12 characters. I'm not exactly sure, so don't take my word for it. But after that, you're going to have an I++, meaning after every iteration, it's going to increase it by 1. You could obviously change this to I plus equals 5 or some other value, depending on how much you want to increase it by after every iteration. So now all we're going to do is print out s.char at I, and it's going to print out this result, where each index of the S string, hello world, is going to be printed out. H, then E, then L, then L, then O, and so on. So So now let's look at while loops. While loops are pretty much the same. However, you're not going to do everything inside of the parentheses. So a good thing to remember is you can do anything a for loop does with a while loop. However, not in all situations can you do everything a while loop does with a for loop. Okay, so what we do here is declare the int I outside of the loop and then have our I less than s.length, which is our conditional statement, and then I++. So if you notice, all of the stuff that we mentioned earlier in this for loop is the same. However, all we did is kind of rearrange it and put it at different places, which is a good key difference you need to notice. So now let's do Unit 5, writing classes. So when writing classes, you gotta know your getters and setters. Oftentimes you're gonna wanna have a method that can return you the age value, or you can set the age value and other instance variables. Because in this instance, we can't directly call them as they're private, meaning we can't access them. We need to use a set name, get age, get name, and these methods to do it. Now let's do static methods. Static methods are kind of confusing because you often don't use them. The reason you don't often use them is, let's say you have 20 different objects of this one class, and all of them you have a fee instance variable. The thing is, if you change the fee variable for one of them, it's going to change that value for all of them. Meaning, let's say you set fee equal to 5 for your first instance variable, but by the time you get to your 20th, you set the instance variable for the 20th object as fee equals 15. That means all the instance variables from 1 to 20 would be equal to 15. And it kind of makes it not really valuable, but also make sure whenever you want to use a static variable, you can only call them in static methods. So never use them inside of a normal method, I guess. Yeah. And now let's get into Unit 6, which is arrays. So arrays, it's mainly just remembering the syntax, where you first have to declare the data type of the array, then you have your quick braces, and of course we're going to also talk about 2D arrays later in this video. So you have your braces, then a space, and now you would mention the name of your variable, and then the new int of length 20 in this case. So inside of these braces, notice how they are square braces and not the other ones that we've been using for declaring objects. So you have to, inside of that, declare the length of your array, as you cannot change the name of your array by default. And arrays by default will initialize their value to 0, in this case, because it's an integer. That's also the same for doubles. However, for, let's say, strings, they're going to be initialized to like an empty string. So now, how do we traverse an array? Well, it's quite similar to how we traversed a string. So you'd have an int I equals 0, I is less than r.length. Notice in here, for arrays, you don't need any parentheses as it's inbuilt and provided to you, and then your standard I++. Now to access each index, what you want to do is write out the name of your array, and then using the square brackets, you want to inside mention a number, which should be the index of your array. Now you always want to make sure this I value is never more than the length of your array. So let's say maybe you mention you want to access array at index 21 or 22. Those are obviously going to cause a big issue in your code and cause it to crash. So now let's do some practice. Loop through an array of 10 indices and set each of them equal to 0. Pause the video now and work on that. Okay, so this is how you would do it. The first step is obviously declaring your array of 10 indices, which would be int r, new int, and notice how we have 10 here, meaning 10 indices. And now we'll have our for loop. So for int I equals 0, I is less than r dot length I plus plus. So you can kind of memorize this type of code as you're often going to be repeating and repeating it for multiple FRQs. And notice how for each index, we set it equal to 100. So that's how you would do it, basically. Now let's talk into ArrayList. A big issue with arrays is that you can't change the length of an array. However, for ArrayList, we get rid of that issue. So how you declare it is a bit different, where ArrayList, and then you have these less than and greater than symbols, and inside of that you mention the data type of your array list. Now notice how our string is uppercase. Well, by default it's always like that. However, if you want to call a default data type like an integer or maybe a boolean or maybe a double, you're also going to have to use a wrapper class. A wrapper class is basically where you have to write out the whole name and make sure the first letter is capitalized. It's basically a class of an integer, I guess. Yeah, of an integer, in this case a class for strings. So we would say r is equal to new array list string and then parentheses. Notice how we have this empty. However, if you want to mention how many values you want, you could definitely do that. And keep in mind, you can mention maybe you want 10 indices. Remember that you can always add more. There's no harm in adding more values to it. So let's look at some examples. How do we add items to this array list? Well, you do r.add and make sure you provide an object inside of the same object as this. In this case, we're providing a string, which is a string. So that works. Then we want to add r.add jack at the index 0. So what that's basically going to do is move hello to index 1 and move jack to index 0. Then let's say we do r.remove 1. So what's going to happen is r.remove 1 is going to get rid of the hello because that's in the index 0. And then finally, we do r.get 0, which is going to get us the value being stored inside of the index 0. And that's going to be jack in this instance. So pause the video and maybe listen to me again about what I just said. Now let's say we want to traverse an array list. So for traversing array lists, for me personally, I find the best option is using a for each loop, where it's basically you have for string, in this case that is the data type of this array, string, and then some random variable name, :r, which is our array list, right? Why I find this to be the best option often is what it ensures is if you get rid of some value in r, it wouldn't make this loop crash and get confused. So in this case, all we are doing is printing out all the values inside of r, and it's pretty simple. However, as you get into more complicated programs, it's going to be much more easier for you to delete items without having to worry about the loop crashing. So that's very nice and makes it much more easier for you to run your code. So let's do a practice. can you declare an array list of an object called testing? Pause the video right now and test it out. Okay, so this is how you do it. Array list, and inside of the less than greater than signs, you're going to have your data type, which is obviously testing. And then you can have some random name here, ArrayList, or anything. And that is equal to new array list. And again, you have to mention your data type, testing, and then parentheses. Of course, you could have mentioned you want maybe by default 5 objects in here, but that's not necessary. So now let's get into Unit 8, 2D arrays. So the first step to understand is how do you declare 2D arrays? So what you do is the same as how you would do for a 1D array. You would have your data type, in this case int, and then instead of having 1 square brackets, you're going to have 2 square brackets. And after that, the name of the variable, and then new int as usual, but now we have 2 square brackets. That means you have to mention the length and the width of your 2D array. So what this provides you is the row of your array, and this provides you the column. So now let's look at how we would loop through a 2D array. So normally for a 1D array, we loop using 1 loop. However, for a 2D array, we're going to need to use 2 loops. So as you can see, we have our first loop, which is looping through the I would say the column, and the inside would be looping through the rows. Or actually, it wouldn't matter in this case because our rows and column are the same value. However, it's also possible that you could have it as, let's say for your rows, you have it as 3, while for your column, you have it as 5. So it's very important that you make sure that you set it to the right values. In this case, this was done wrong, where the j should have been in the rows and the I should have been in the columns, because I is looping through the columns of the 2D array. Now let's get into Unit 9, inheritance. So inheritance is definitely one of the most tricky topics of this video, so we'll get into it. So let's say we want to have an extends, right? So we have our superclass, which is class animal, and then our other class, which is cat. So all we do is class cat extends animal, which is the default stuff, as you guys know. And then we have methods. So what the nice thing of inheritance is, cat can also access these values in class animal, these methods, right? So we could call, for an object declared as cat, we could call the act and the .speak of the animal class, which is a nice feature that gives us much more options and ability to do things in our code. So now let's talk about polymorphism. So let's say we declared animal AC equal to new cat, right? And now we want to run ac.speak. Would that work, or would the code crash? And if it does work, what would be printed out? So pause the video and figure it out. Okay, so if you guys figured it out, it would work. However, would it print out I'm talking right now, or would it print out meow? So if you know your stuff, you would obviously say it would print out meow, because the code here would override the speak method in animal. So now let's do another one. ac.speak. Sleep. Would that work? Well, no, it wouldn't work, because AC is an animal object. And obviously here, we don't see any object, any method called sleep in the animal class. Would ac.act work? Yes, it would work, and it would print out I am acting right now, because that is the only method, and specifically it is in the animal class. Now finally, would this work? Well, yes, it would. Because basically what we did is we downcasted our variable AC to the cat class, where it can now basically look in here. Can it see any sleep method? Well, yes, it can. It can see this. And what it's going to print out is sleeping. Now the final unit, unit 10, recursion. So you're probably going to see this maybe 1 or 2 questions in the MCQ, but it's important to understand. So the best way to understand recursion is probably having a piece of paper and pencil, because it's basically a lot of just keeping track of things and making sure nothing goes out of control. So let's say we want to return result 5 from this code. So if we look, all it does is return 2 times result n minus 1. For result 5, that would mean it would return 2 times result 4. Well, what is result 4? So we could run this code back again. Result 4 equals 2 times result 3. Then result 3 equals 2 times result 2. And result 2 equals 2 times result 1. And now we're at that point where 1 is equal to 1, meaning all it's going to do is return 2. So now what we can do is plug these values back into here, and let's see what happens. So we'll get rid of result 1, my bad, and we're going to replace it with 2. 2 times 2 gets us 4. Now we'll replace result 2 up here with 4. So get rid of it, and then 4. 2 times 4 is 8. So we're going to get rid of this and replace it with 8. 2 times 8 is 16. So we're going to replace this and get us 16 there. And if we do 2 times 16 correctly, we would get 32. So that's basically how recursion works and how you'd want to do this. So obviously these are a bunch of topics, which this is just a basic review for you to get ready for the test. I would definitely recommend looking at some more multiple choice and FRQs while preparing for your test to fully know what is going to be on there and what to expect. Good luck!